All right, good evening. I am pleased to welcome you to the library's temporary space at Marshall School. If this is your first time visiting us here, I hope you get the chance to take a look around to see how we were able to make this building a welcoming, useful space for you while our library undergoes a renovation and expansion. This school was built in 1958 by Minoru Yamasaki, who designed many buildings you are probably familiar with, but also several smaller buildings like this one around the area in the early days of his career. It is interesting to look around and notice features that reflect his style and philosophies while we use this space. Lucky for us, tonight we have an expert to talk with us about Yamasaki's legacy and his place in mid-century architecture. John Gallagher is a retired Detroit Free Press columnist, veteran journalist, and author of the book Yamasaki in Detroit, A Search for Serenity. It is my pleasure to welcome you here and welcome John here. And thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoy the presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So we have a fairly small group here in person, so just feel free to raise a hand if you have any questions or anything. As Aubrey said, we are in a Yamasaki building, which is good. I usually don't lecture in Yamasaki buildings, but you see one on the cover of my book. This is the McGregor Center at Wayne State University, one of his finest buildings, and we'll talk a lot about that as we go along. You probably know the name Yamasaki. He designed the World Trade Center Twin Towers in New York, the ones that were destroyed on 9/11, and that's his most famous building, and he did buildings all over the world. He did skyscrapers in Spain. He did airports in Saudi Arabia. He did university buildings all over. But you may not know he actually lived and worked here for the last 40 years of his life, and did many important buildings here in the Detroit area. So we'll talk about that and really what his legacy is. So this is Minoru Yamasaki, famous mid-century modernist architect. He was born in Seattle in 1912. Here he is with his parents. His parents were Japanese immigrants who came to Seattle, met in Seattle and married there, and had their family there. And the photo makes them look fairly prosperous. In fact, they were quite poor, as a lot of immigrants' families are. And like a lot of immigrant families, they worked very hard to advance themselves. They placed enormous stress on education for their kids as a way to sort of get into the American mainstream. And they put a lot of stress on their eldest son, Minoru, to be sort of the one who would carry the banner of the family into the future through education and through his efforts. So he went to college in Seattle, University of Washington, studied architecture. And again, the family didn't have a lot of money to pay for education, so in the summer times he had a job working in the fish canneries in Alaska. Now these were terrible jobs. They were dirty, unsanitary fish canneries, brutal bosses, long hours, terrible food, dormitories for the workers filled with bed bugs. And it was really pretty disagreeable. And Yama took from that the sense that he needed sort of humane conditions to feel just human. That simple as decent food, clean sheets at night, a humane boss. And so he developed this mantra that he would try to inject into his architecture of serenity, surprise, and delight. That is, he wanted people to really feel serene in his architecture. Now this is at a time when Mies van der Rohe and the other leading architects of the day were developing the international style, sometimes known as the glass box style, glass and steel. And the famous European theorist, Le Corbusier, talked about a building is a machine for living. Well, that's about as far from what Yama was doing. Yama wanted the human touch in all of his buildings. So anyway, we'll talk more about this. He goes to New York after he graduates. Again, we're in the middle of the Depression. And besides working part-time here and there for different architectural firms, he teaches watercoloring at Columbia University and other places. And this is one of his watercolors. So he's very talented. He's recognized from the very beginning as having a very talented guy. And in his papers, which are collected at the Reuther Library at Wayne State University, where I did a lot of my research, you find all these letters from the colleges and other firms he worked for in the 30s when he was in his 20s, saying, well, we can't keep you on anymore because we don't have any more work for you, but we want to hire you back as soon as we can because, you know, you did such a great job for us. So he was recognized very early on as really a very special kind of person. Well, during World War II, of course, he's Japanese American, and we know what was happening in California with the Japanese. They were being put in internment camps. And he himself suffered a fair amount of discrimination. People coming up to him, you know, in the subway or on the street and grabbing him by the lapels and saying, "Are you a Jap spy or something?" I mean, you know, he put up with a lot of that stuff. But he was so manifestly talented that he was put in charge of designing this naval training base in upstate New York in the Finger Lakes district. He was given complete control of designing this, the Sampson Naval Training Base up in the Finger Lakes district of upstate New York. And he designed every structure, and then he oversaw the construction of them. And he later said it was the best training he ever got to run his own firm one day. So he's doing all this in his late 20s. Here he is here speaking. He was also politically active at this time. This is the Japanese Relocation Society in New York, and we're trying to get Japanese in better places, get them out of internment camps and get them in better places. And he was quite active in this kind of thing as a young man. Later, he became too busy and too famous to stay in politics. He was totally consumed by his architectural practice. But this is Yama as a young man. He's probably about 30 at this point. After the naval training base, he goes back to New York and he designs housing projects. A lot of them redesign older sort of 1910 housing projects that he would sort of modernize. And this is one of his sketches that he did for a housing project in New York. And you can see, first off, he is a very good sort of freehand sketch artist. I really like these little human figures that you see at the bottom. Just with this little simple line, you get an indication of a human being, but even movement, I mean, just walking. And so very, very, you know, good sketch artist. But he's also a modernist. So, I mean, this is a very modernist looking building. And so that's the style he wanted to practice in. And we'll talk more about that. Anyway, he, at the end of World War II, in Detroit, the firm Smith Hinchman Grills, which had been it is the city's oldest, it's now known as Smith Group, the city's oldest and largest and most famous architectural firm. They did the Guardian Building and the Penobscot Building and all that stuff. But then during the Depression and World War II, they didn't do much really great design work. It was all war work or whatever. And so they wanted to get kind of some design sort of reputation back. And they needed a new chief designer. And they heard about this young guy in New York who had this growing reputation. And so they brought Yama to Detroit. They doubled his salary, hired him. He thought that, apparently he thought that he would stay here for a couple of years and move on. And of course, he spent the rest of his life here. This is his first major commission in Detroit. This is the Federal Reserve Annex building, the modern part in the middle. So the older bank building in the foreground on the corner, that's the Federal Reserve built that in the 1920s, and that's a cash depository. Cash goes in and cash goes out to banks and so on. There's a new one on Warren near Eastern Market. I don't know if you ever saw that one. And there's something, it can hold something like $1 billion in cash. But this was a cash depository. And in the late 40s, they needed to expand this with some more office space and so on. And so Yama designed this. And this was the first modern building in downtown Detroit. And was such a hit that any building after that was done in some sort of modernist style. But what's really significant here, you notice how the building is set back about 30 feet from the street. It's recessed a little bit. And there's a little plaza in there, which is a little hard to see here. But this was trademark Yamasaki, creating these little outdoor oases with a little water feature, a little landscaping, some benches where you could sit and just relax. Again, serenity, surprise, and delight. Now the Free Press, as it turns out, the last several years I worked for him was in this building. And so I know this very well. And this little plaza, when you sit there outside, it's like you're in the city, but you're out of the hustle and bustle. It's amazing how serene even a little spot like that can feel. And that was something Yama tried to do in all of his buildings, those little oases where people would feel sort of relaxed and human. He stayed with Smith Hinchman a few years, but got frustrated, wanted to run his own firm, and so left with a couple of partners and started his own firm here. And this is a small dental office in Northwest Detroit. He did a lot of this kind of thing, as well as schools like the one we're in now. This is a home. He did some homes. This is in Palmer Woods on 7 Mile near Woodwood. Again, very simple, very modernist. And what's really interesting about that, I was here not long ago for an event, and when you're sitting in the home or when you in the backyard with the trees fenced in, you'd never know that you're a block from Woodward Avenue. You know, Woodward and 7 Mile with all the traffic and everything. It is so serene, so peaceful, and so that's what he was going for in everything that he did. Here, this is Grosse Pointe North. Again, you know, one of the many schools he did, and the original building for this school that was built in the 20s was sort of a Independence Hall in Philadelphia kind of look, you know, very colonial, and so when he did this, not everybody was happy that he did a more modernist building. And in fact, if you look at the letterhead for the school stationery, it still has the old building on it instead of the new building. But he did tons of this kind of stuff around Detroit. And this is the American Concrete Institute headquarters in Northwest Detroit. And this is very typical Yama in that he loved this kind of off-white look. Some people said it mimics marble. It's actually just concrete, precast concrete. The little screen on the end right here, that's just, he took some like PCV pipe and cut it off and created a screen. You notice how the building is set up on a little pedestal, so you take the stairs up to it. He liked to do that little scene setting for his buildings. And the roof line, that repeated diamond roof line, he really liked that. Yes, sir?
Is that a crawl space under, or is there a floor below?
You know, that's a great question, and I don't know because I've never been in the building. I'll check that, and I'll try to find out for next time. I'm sorry, I don't know. Okay. Great question. And of course, his building's photographed really nicely. I mean, he got known for that. Well, anyway, one of his partners was in St. Louis. He had a partner who wanted to open a St. Louis office, and the man's family had some connections. So Yama got 2 commissions in St. Louis early on, and one of them was the airport, Lambert Field in St. Louis. And this is what he did. Now, this is when the jet age was first coming along in the 50s. And if you're old enough to remember the jet age was not just transportation, it was the future, right? This is going to be, you know, this is the Jetsons or something, right? This is where we're going. And so this kind of thing sort of embodied that spirit of the future. And you see, it's remarkable how he takes this enormous sort of concrete dome and brings it down to rest on just the 4 points. So structurally very interesting. Great use of glass, and again, it photographs really well. So this was very well known and made Yama very well known early in his career. He also in St. Louis did and this is much less successful, this is the Pruitt-Igoe public housing. This is one of the first of the big public housing developments that were done after World War II. And they became sort of filing cabinets for poor people. They stuffed them in here. Yama had told them when he got the commission that you should do low-rise buildings. And he had a great quote. He said, man is a ground animal. He needs to live near the grass and the trees to feel human. But the St. Louis authorities insisted on much greater density. So they wound up doing this series of high-rise towers. And they were not popular. They were never maintained, and after about 20 years, that whole thing was just imploded and destroyed. And it became, you know, a symbol of what's wrong with public housing in America. And Yama said it was the worst mistake he ever made in his life. Well, when he was in school, this is the kind of thing that his professors had him study. This is the Palace of Fine Arts in France. And, you know, this effusive old world historical ornamentation, you know, very effusive ornamentation. This is what they were studying. But Yama and he and his other students always thought this was something a little false. I happen to think it's beautiful, but at the time, in the 40s and 50s, most of the young architects were reacting against this sort of thing. What they liked was this is the famous Bauhaus in Germany, which was the home of modernist design, furniture design and architecture and so on. You know, clean lines, absolutely no ornamentation, you know, glass and steel and ceramic tiles and that kind of stuff. And his hero was Mies van der Rohe, the famous architect who did Lafayette Park in Detroit. But this sort of glass box housing kind of thing. One of the most important buildings of the time, this is the Lever House in New York City on Fifth Avenue. This is the first of these international style towers that went up in New York. Very, very influential. So Yama liked this, but he disagreed with the international style people that this is the end. A lot of them thought we found it. You know, this is the end of architecture. This is all we need to do. And Yama thought this is just a way station on the way to something else, some better thing. And again, he's striving to think about how to make these buildings feel more human and more serene for the people in them. So in the mid 50s, 1954 or so, he's been in the hospital. He actually was ill a lot in his life. Obviously, a lot of stress-related diseases because of all the stress he put on himself. I'm bleeding ulcers and that kind of stuff. He was in and out of the hospital his whole life. But anyway, he gets out of the hospital. He's got a commission in Japan, and he's going to take some time off and see the great architecture of the world. So he goes to Japan, and he just falls in love with these tea houses. And he says you can walk along a busy street, bustling street, and you walk in the tea house and everything is serene. And then you walk in the garden in the back and it's as if every leaf is placed by the hand of God. So this is very influential for him. He, by the way, like a lot of first generation immigrants, did not think of himself as Japanese. He said, I'm not Japanese, I'm American. But now he did see his Japanese heritage within himself. Then he goes to Japan or to India, and he visits the Taj Mahal. And again, he is stunned by not only how beautiful the building is, but the grounds, the water feature, the landscaping, the whole site, the whole, you know, composite. And then he goes to Europe and he looks at the great cathedrals of Europe. And again, he's just stunned by how, you know, the interplay of sunlight and shadow across the face of the building. So he absorbs all this, and he's going to try to work all this into his architecture now. And the first chance he gets to do it is here at Wayne State at McGregor, the McGregor Conference Center. The McGregor family had a foundation. They still have it. It's still in town. And they donated the money for this site. And so this is Yama sort of in the full maturity of what he was trying to do. So you have, again, the building is set up kind of on a pedestal, right, for dramatic effect. It's a fairly simple plan. It's 2 wings, 2 meeting rooms, classroom type wings with a atrium that runs down the middle, floor to ceiling atrium. So the skylight runs the whole length of the building. Pardon me. Again, you get the diamond shaped patterns, which he liked a lot. And then the water feature, the sculpture garden, the landscaping. So here, the building itself occupies only about half the site. And this is Yama in total. Most architects would not have done this. So when you're in this building, and I've been here numerous times for events, for weddings, just to sit there, it is one of the most serene spots in Detroit, in the middle of the busy campus, in the middle of the busy city. Last time I spoke, there was a woman who said she went to school here, and when things got pretty tense in class, she would go and sit at McGregor just to decompress. And that's exactly what Yama was going for. This is the Reynolds Metals building in Southfield. It's an office building, suburban office building. And again, you see he sites the building amid a beautiful water feature. He sets the building up. He has this, aluminum screen around the building. And again, it just photographs really, really well. Unfortunately, this is boarded up now. It became a health club, a workout center, and now it's boarded up. The water feature's been paved over. So this is an example of how Yama is one of those architects where you have to sort of buy the whole program to get what he was getting at. I mean, you can't. I say it's like Frank Lloyd Wright. You can't go into a Wright home and take out his furniture and put in, IKEA or whatever. I mean, you need to buy the whole thing. And that was what Yama was like. Anyway, he's back at Wayne State. This is Drury Auditorium, a beautiful, serene little perfect space for lectures and that kind of thing. This also has a water feature around it. And like McGregor, Wayne State years ago drained both of those. And for a long time, they had some troubles, some trouble with, kids throwing stones in them or something. So they drained them, and for many, many years, you had just these empty concrete basins around these two buildings. Well, they've restored McGregor a few years, about 10 years ago, which is you saw in the photo, and then they're in the process of doing DeRoy right now. So restoring Yama's vision to what it was originally. And he also, yes?
What was the time period that he worked on Wayne State's campus?
In the 50s, mid to late 50s, yeah. I'm sorry, for the tape.
If you said that, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I'm sorry, I have to repeat the question for the tape, but yeah. When was he working at Wayne State? And the answer is in the mid 50s, when he's probably in his mid 40s at that point. And this is now known as One Woodward downtown. It's the gas company building, and again, one of the first of the modern high-rise buildings in Yamasaki style. And again, you don't really see too well in this photo, but the little seating area in front, they had a sculpture, beautiful sculpture that's been removed, and a little water feature. Some of it's been taken down. This is his original lobby, and if you notice on the ceiling, those little blue lights, since this was the gas company building, the blue lights are supposed to represent the pilot light, the little blue flame of a pilot light. And he worked very, very hard to get the exact shade of blue and the exact type of metal that crisscrosses and the exact right marble in the lobby. So, I mean, he was a real perfectionist. And I was told by people who worked for him, he would go up to the people doing the air conditioning, for example, and say, now you too are designing this building with me. You two are part of the team. And he was, as one of his people said, he would have been the greatest football coach ever. I mean, just, like Dan Campbell, just, involving everybody in the process. Anyway, Dan Gilbert owns this building now, and I think he's done a lot of good, but they've kind of messed up the lobby. I think there's a lot more furniture in it now and more artwork. I prefer this kind of thing. Yes, sir.
Did he hang around after the construction for the repair of the air conditioning units? Because from my experience of the different buildings where I've been, repair needs to be done, if not annually, biannually.
Yeah, the question is, after the building was finished, would he come back and do upgrades and repairs? It depends on the building. Some relationships he had with Wayne State, for example, were ongoing. He also designed a campus plan, which was more or less followed. The campus plan you see there now, where they closed 2nd Avenue and so on. So some clients he stayed with, and others he probably just moved on. When they were done, they moved on to the next one. So it would be on a case-by-case basis. Okay. Let's see, where else we're here. This is a building in Minneapolis. This is an insurance company building. And again, it's similar in some ways to some of his other stuff. This style became known as New Formalism because, again, the columns to some critics, represented sort of Greek, classical columns. And again, you have the off-white precast concrete that mimics marble in some ways. And some people thought this is a bad imitation Greek temple. And he was criticized a lot for this. He became known as a decorator, someone who wrapped a frilly screen around a Miesian glass box. And it's only when you came to these places and you saw how serene these environments are that you began to appreciate them. Now, a friend of mine, a man named Eric Hill, who's an architect, and he and I wrote the AIA Detroit Guide to Detroit Architecture. He was studied in Boston in the early 60s and was taught this about Yamasaki, that Yama was just, he was doing wallpaper, he was a decorator. And then he came to Detroit to work here and went to places like McGregor and just realized how wonderful it feels just to be at McGregor's. So I think you had to sort of be in Yama's building to see how good they made you feel. And this is the Science Pavilion at the World's Fair in Seattle in 1962. And Yama designed the buildings as well as the water feature and this entrance feature, which is just sort of a spider web kind of thing, but really, really beautiful. And this is the turning point for Yamasaki, because in New York at this time in the early 60s, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey is planning to build a huge office complex in Lower Manhattan. And they sent one of their executives out to Seattle just to look around and see if he could see any architecture that impressed them. And he saw this and he was just blown away by this. He didn't know who Yama was, but he was blown away by this. So the Port Authority accepts it, and they try to recruit Yamasaki to design what became the World Trade Center, Twin Towers. And first he tells me he can't do it. He said, it's way too, I've got a small firm, I've only got 40 people, I can't possibly handle a job that in today's dollars would cost, billions of dollars. But they really wanted him, and so eventually he agreed. And this is the photograph they put out of Yamasaki with the press release saying, we've hired Minoru Yamasaki to design the Twin Towers. So he's about 50 years old here, and you see the One Woodward building wall in the background. So this is the beginning of the saga of the World Trade Center, which took him 10 years, both made him and some would say almost destroyed him, because the towers, as you know, were highly criticized. They eventually, when they first designed them, they were sort of said, oh, this is really great stuff. But eventually all the critics said these things are just way too big, too out of place, and too out of place on the Manhattan skyline, and just not successful at all. So Yama was famous for his model making in his office, and these are some of the models of the World Trade Center that were so big he had to remove the ceiling tiles so they could get these models in his office. And here is the finished product. But there's a tremendous amount of innovative engineering that went into these that Yama was quite proud of, and he was quite hurt by the criticism that these are aesthetically a failure. Among much else, when you take an elevator in this building, they had express and local elevators, because if you had elevators that went the whole way, it would take up too much space. You'd have to have too many, and it would take up too much space in the core, and you would lose too much office, floor space. So they did this express and local elevators, and saved something like 10% of the possible floor space for use that the Port Authority could then rent out. So, and then another thing, the screen on the outside of the building looks really decorative, but it's actually the bracing, the wind bracing, because you probably know skyscrapers sway in the wind, and if you're on the 110th floor here, you can have some pretty nasty effects in a high wind. And so all skyscrapers have bracing, which is usually in the middle, in the core, and it holds the building more rigidly. And in this case, it's on the exterior, again, freeing up a lot of that interior space for rentable floor space. And I was told, and I'm not an engineer, so I don't know, but I was told that the reason the towers stood as long as they did on 9/11 is because the bracing, basically held them up before the whole thing just got overwhelmed. But at any rate, these buildings made Yama internationally famous. He's on the cover of Time Magazine, one of the few architects who ever had that. He's here at the White House meeting President Johnson. And he starts working internationally. Here's a banknote from Saudi Arabia with the image of Yama's airport from Saudi Arabia. He did lots of work in Saudi Arabia. Did work all over the world, but a lot of work in Saudi Arabia. The Saudi Monetary Fund building, he did, a lot of other stuff. This is in Seattle, where he started doing skyscrapers all over the world. This is in Seattle. Some people call this the Golf Tee building because it narrows down. Here's a couple of, this is Century City in Los Angeles, and a bank building in Minneapolis and one in Buffalo. Now, one of the things you hear about Yamasaki is that his shorter buildings are more serene and more of what he was trying to accomplish than these tall buildings. And I agree with that. This is a library at Butler University in Indiana. And to me, this is not only much more aesthetically pleasing to me, to my eye, but I think also much closer to what Yama was looking for. That's, serene, human scale kind of design. So I think that's a valid point. Even in his 60s and early 70s, he's working all over the world. He still designs here. This is a home he built for he and his wife. He had a kind of an unusual personal life. He was married for 25 years, got too famous and got divorced and had two very short-lived marriages, including one with a nurse while he was in the hospital, and then reunited with his wife and remarried and was married for another 15 years. So kind of an unusual, pattern there. But anyway, he designed this home for them in Bloomfield Hills, and it's still there. It's owned by another designer now.
And with the same furniture?
Well, it's a good question. I think a lot of it's probably new, but the same kind of furniture, that they had. So he lived here as long as he lived, and then his widow lived here, for several years until she passed. And of course, Temple Bethel on Telegraph Road in Oakland County, which is one of his last great buildings here. Here's the interior. And again, you notice how, like the airport in St. Louis, how this enormous concrete structure comes down to rest on a few points so that you can open up the windows all around. So you get that inside-out view to nature, which was so important to him, that connection with nature. He also does a neat little trick with the seating, because most religious buildings have a certain number of people coming on an ordinary, week, and then on high holy days they get a lot more. So where do you put the overflow? Well, you put them in the church basement or in the cafeteria or whatever with closed circuit television. What Yama did is create these side aisles that you can sort of see there, the red side aisles, and you can put extra seating in there, kind of like we have here tonight. And then you take it out when you don't need it. So it's not intrusive as it would be in some places. And again, his buildings just photograph really beautifully. So he worked to the very end. He died of cancer in 1986 in his mid-70s. I think when I think about his legacy, besides he had a lot of great buildings that we still have that are still in great shape, but I think the idea that any important public building has to have a plaza, a water feature, landscaping, a walking path. I mean, some sort of public space that pays attention to how we feel as humans in that space. I think that's completely accepted now. And it's so much so that I don't think anyone even necessarily thinks it's due to Yamasaki, but he was a major proponent of that idea that we have to feel human in these buildings. And finally, there was a great quote one of his co-workers said, that he said, Yama was an architect like we always think our architects should be. I mean, he gave his whole life to it. So with that, I'm happy to take your thoughts, questions. Yes, sir. Oh, and we'll get a microphone here, so we'll get you on tape, okay? So, hang on.
Now, I worked with Yazaki over on 275 and Warren Road.
Okay.
And I'm just wondering if Yamasaki designed the headquarters that were not built until 98. Were there designs that he did which came to fruition after his death?
There were some office buildings in Oakland County, suburban office buildings, that the firm was working on and continued to work on after he died. I don't know of any major projects where it sat there for 20 years and then got built. I don't know of any like that. He did have, I mean, all architects have buildings that they designed that never get built. He did, in addition to the DIA, for example, the Art Institute in Detroit, that never got built. Eventually they hired Gunnar Berkowitz to do it. So he had a lot of those, but all architects have those. So, yes, what else? Yes, sir.
I'm very lucky to have just purchased a Yamasaki home in Grosse Pointe Woods.
Oh,
and
perfect.
We discussed that via email recently, and
Yeah.
there's a very small commission that he had in 1952. And as you spoke, I've noticed a few things about my home that are evident in a lot of the buildings that he's done. It's set back further from the road than the other neighboring homes. It's the only one of its type in my neighborhood. A lot of ranches and Cape Cod styles, 1950s, but mine is set back further than the other homes, which is interesting. It has a large back lot. But I'm very lucky when you talk about the serenity of that house. In just the short time that I've been in it, it's the glass windows in the front that match the glass windows in the rear. It feels like you can walk right through the house. You could come to my house, walk right through it, and end up in the backyard. But there is a certain amount of serenity that I've had in the short time that I've been there, just looking out into the backyard in the evening and enjoying it, and I look forward to enjoying it when it warms up. The question I have, though, is in 1952, how involved do you think he would have been with the commission and that project? Do you think he would have been actually doing a lot of the design, or do you think he oversaw it with maybe some of his junior?
Yeah, great question. I think at that point he would have been totally involved in the design. I'd be surprised if he didn't do all of it himself. I know he had a couple of partners. A lot of architects, they have multiple partners that come and go and, all kinds of arrangements. And he had a partner named Carl Greimel, who later became dean at Lawrence Tech, dean of architecture at Lawrence Tech. He was a friend of mine. And he did homes in somewhat similar style, but I would be very surprised if Yama didn't do all of that one. And at his firm later, one of his partners made clear, even though he was very encouraging to all his people, at the same time it was Yama's firm, and you knew that. And this one partner said later, when I was doing the research for the book, that Yama ran it with a benevolent iron hand. It was his firm and his vision, but he loved you for working with them and he wanted you to do your best, but it was his vision that was going to happen. So, yeah, so I think you got a Yamasaki home there.
Well, that's great. That's exciting. And I'm lucky to have the original blueprints and the original scope book with handwritten notes in there that may very well have been his and came with the house. So I look forward to restoring it, and
Wow.
I want to restore it to its. Unfortunately, it hasn't. It's the same footprint. It's just a tiny 1,200 square foot home, but so luckily nothing has been really changed too much in the structure. But it's been covered with aluminum or vinyl siding over the cinder block. Some of the windows have been replaced, and they're not correct. So I look forward to restoring it and really making it kind of. And luckily I have photographs from 1953 and 1952, so good guide. But it's nice to know that he was probably very involved in the design.
I'd be happy to come out and take a look.
I'd love that.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. That's
All right.
great.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, what else? By the way, I have copies of my book if anyone would like to get an autographed copy. It's $40 cash or check. I can't do credit cards yet, but I'm getting one of those little square things, but I don't have that yet. So, but other thoughts, comments?
With the sculpture work that were involved in some of the like outdoor spaces, was he involved? Was that his work? Is it rotating from different artists?
He would hire other artists
Okay.
to do it. He did not do sculpture himself. He did watercoloring, obviously, but he didn't do sculpture. But so that they would be others, but he would work with them very closely.
Okay.
And things like the doors that he might have on the McGregor Center, he would hire an artist to do the doors
Okay.
for him. But again, he would oversee everything.
So like at the McGregor Center, are those the original sculptures that you
Yes.
see in the outdoor? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, yeah. Have you been down there?
No, I haven't, but
Yeah.
I'd like to now.
It's really a great spot. And again, it's just, you realize you're in the middle of a big city, but sitting
Yeah.
there by that pool and the sculpture garden, it's just very, very peaceful and tranquil.
Oh, yeah. Well,
Helps
thank
you
you.
de-stress.
Yeah.
So. Yes, over here.
Do we know what happened to his watercolors?
Well, the one that I showed is in his papers at the Reuther Library at Wayne State, where I did my research. And the others, I presume either the family has them or that his, they gave them to friends or whatever. But yeah, the one that I had access to was that one, along with that photograph of him as a toddler. That all came from his papers at Wayne State. I was fortunate that that's where they were because, I was working full time at the Free Press, so I'd run up there at lunch hour and go through another couple of boxes and that kind of stuff. So.
Any other questions?
Sure. Yeah,
Do you know what line of work his father and mother were in?
His mother, as far as I know, is a homemaker. His father had different jobs, salesman in like a shoe store and that kind of,
Okay.
fairly first generation.
Okay, I was
immigrant.
wondering if there was like any creativity or, where it kind of came from or what sparked.
Well, he did have an uncle, his mother's brother, who was an architect before him.
Oh, okay.
And graduated from, I believe it was California, one of the universities in California, and visited the Yama's family in Seattle when Yama was about 16. And showed him a drawing that he had worked on, a design. And Yamasaki attributed his vocation to that moment.
that,
He said,
wow.
from that moment, I never wavered.
Incredible.
He talks about how, as a teenager, all he cared about was baseball and girls. But the moment he saw this drawing, he knew what he
Yeah.
was going to do with his life and that he never wavered from
Oh,
that.
that's great.
So-
That's great. And then how did he get commissioned for this building? Do you,
That I don't know exactly.
Oh, okay.
But again, he was getting a reputation early on
Yeah.
for quality work, and he was a modernist at a time when a lot of people were still doing the older historical styles. And people who knew him would tell me that he had this sort of aura of sort of the guru. It's interesting that he put up with a lot of discrimination as a young guy because of his Japanese ancestry, but at some point it began to work in his favor a little bit because he was sort of exotic and as I said, the guru who spoke this new language of architecture. So he became successful very early on. So. Okay, well listen, I really appreciate you coming, and if anyone wants the book, I'll be over here, but thank you very much.
Thank you for watching our presentation. In order to discover upcoming events at the library, please visit our website, westlandlibrary.org, and click on our events calendar for a full list of everything that we have. You can also visit our Facebook page at Westland Library for daily updates. Thank you for watching, and we hope to see you soon.